This is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. I occupy the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies. It's a teaching and research unit, and this is an elective course being offered by the Chair for both UG and PG students across India. An interdisciplinary course, it introduces, explicates, and explores various dimensions of an emerging discipline, what we are calling vulnerability studies. We are all vulnerable. Different species are vulnerable, and the planet is vulnerable. In fact, as critics have noted, the planet lives through and is moving towards precarious times in incremental doses. This course opens with examples, theories, concepts defining vulnerability, precarity, fragility. It looks at modes of approaching vulnerability, from risk analysis to cultural representations of different forms of the vulnerable. Noting that the word vulnerable comes from, etymologically speaking, the word to signify wounds, vulness, to be wounded. The opening segments of the course, by exploring these definitions, focuses on bodies and situations in which lives are lived and lives are rendered woundable or injurable. From this particular foundation of contexts and theories, we then move on to examining very specific domains and very specific dimensions of forms of vulnerability. The focus remains vulnerable bodies in literature and cultural texts. So we will be looking at social identities and vulnerability, vulnerable bodies that have opted for or deigned to immerse themselves in, for example, extreme sports, rendering themselves vulnerable, aging bodies, refugee bodies, laboring bodies, and the medicalized or sick bodies. An entire segment will be devoted to the aesthetics of vulnerability, specifically traumatic materialism, melodrama, and the sublime. Given that this course appears a little after the pandemic vulnerabilities and their biopolitics ought to figure, and it does. So we will be looking at pandemic vulnerabilities, both historical and contemporary. We will be looking at industrial disasters such as Bhopal, but we will also look at genocides, which are conscious efforts at rendering some populations, some segments of the society vulnerable. We then move on to ecological precarity, and we look at literary and cultural texts that talk about eco-dystopias, ecological disasters, that are the subject of concern and the subject of interest for people working across media, cultural studies, and literary studies. Then we have two components, one on aging and one on childhood and vulnerabilities. And we will round off the course with an examination of resilience and resistance as mapped in various texts. Thank you.